The Copa room thrummed with cigarette smoke and whispered power. Crystal glasses caught amber light while 300 of entertainment's elite pressed shoulder to shoulder in a space designed for half that number. The air felt thick with ambition and bourbon. Waiters in white jackets moved between tables, refilling glasses that never emptied, while photographers from Life and Look prowled the edges. This wasn't a public show. This was invitation only. This was where careers lived and died on a single word from the right mouth. Dean Martin had just finished his final set. The king of cool stood at the bar now, bow tie loosened, that lazy grin playing at his lips while admirers circled like planets around the sun. At 40, Dean commanded Vegas like Caesar commanded Rome. Every night sold out. Every joke perfectly timed. Every song delivered with that effortless magic that made millionaires feel like they were hearing music for the first time. But tonight, something had shifted his attention. 3 tables back from the inner circle, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a figure that didn't belong in this world of cigar smoke and masculine swagger. Audrey Hepburn, 28 years old, wore a simple black Givenchy dress that made everyone else's luxury look desperate. No jewelry except small pearl earrings, hair pulled back in that signature style. She sipped champagne and watched, but she wasn't performing. In a room where everyone was playing some version of themselves, she simply existed. And that somehow was what caught Dean's attention. The stillness in a room designed for motion. What Dean couldn't see was the exhaustion behind those famous eyes. Audrey had been traveling for weeks. Premieres, interviews, studio meetings. Her agent had insisted she come tonight. "Good for your image," he'd said. Her husband, Mel Ferrer, leaned close, whispering something that made her nod politely. She glanced at her watch. She wanted to leave. Paramount had sent her here after her Oscar win for Roman Holiday. "Good publicity," they said. "Be seen with the Rat Pack. Show Hollywood you belong in every room." But Audrey had learned something during 5 years under Nazi occupation that Hollywood would never understand. She had learned the difference between belonging and surviving. Dean pushed away from the bar. When he moved, conversations paused. Photographers lifted cameras. Something was about to happen, and in Vegas, when Dean Martin decided something was about to happen, the smart money paid attention. He walked toward her table with that signature Dean Martin swagger. Not hurried, never hurried, just inevitable. The crowd parted instinctively. This was theater, and everyone knew their role except maybe the woman at table 7 who sat perfectly still, watching him approach. But what nobody in that room knew was what Audrey saw when she looked at Dean Martin walking toward her. She didn't see the king of cool or the Rat Pack legend. She saw a man with power who assumed compliance. And something deep in her chest, something forged in wartime Holland, went very quiet and very still. "Miss Hepburn," Dean's voice carried that familiar warmth, pitched perfectly for the surrounding tables to hear. "Hollywood's newest princess, gracing us with her presence." Audrey looked up, her face composed, polite. She nodded once. "Mr. Martin, thank you for a beautiful performance." That smile, the one that had charmed millions, spread across Dean's face. "Beautiful? Baby, that was just the warm-up." He gestured to the room with his martini glass. "The real magic happens when the audience becomes the show." Behind him, Sammy Davis Jr. had gone quiet. Frank Sinatra leaned forward in his chair. Something in the air had changed, grown dense with expectation. "I'm not sure I understand," Audrey said softly. Dean chuckled, playing to his audience now. "Come on, doll. Don't be modest. Everyone here wants to hear that voice with that face." He pointed to the small stage. "Sing for us." The words landed in silence. Not the silence of anticipation, but something deeper. Something that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. And in that silence, Audrey Hepburn was no longer sitting in the Copa room at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas in 1957. She was 16 years old in a bombed-out basement in Arnhem, surrounded by German officers who had discovered their secret resistance performance. The air had smelled of wet concrete and fear. The officer in charge, young and drunk on power, had pointed at her with the same casual authority Dean Martin was showing now. "Dance for us, little ballerina. Show us what Dutch grace looks like." The other performers, her friends from the conservatory, had been lined against the wall like condemned prisoners. Anna, barely 14, tears streaming down her cheeks. They all looked at her with expressions that begged her to comply, to do whatever it took to keep them all alive. She had danced that night. She had smiled and turned and leaped on legs weak from hunger, while her friends watched in terror, and her mother stood in the corner with eyes full of helpless rage. She had performed because the alternative was bullets. She had survived because she gave them what they demanded. But with every leap, every turn, every forced smile, something inside her had been breaking. That night, as she curtsied to Nazi applause, she had made herself a promise. When the war ended, when she was free, she would never again dance on command. Never again would she perform for someone else's pleasure while her soul screamed in protest. Now, 11 years later, another man with power was pointing at her and making demands. The setting had changed. The music was different. But the expectation was exactly the same. You will perform because I say so. You will comply because I have the power to make your life easier or harder based on your response. Audrey set down her champagne glass. The crystal made a soft sound against the white tablecloth. I'm not a singer, Mr. Martin. I'm an actress. Dean straightened, spread his arms wide, his grin never faltering. And this is a performance, sweetheart. Come on. His voice grew louder, ensuring everyone could hear. One song. For me? For all of us who came to see Vegas Magic? The room leaned forward. 300 people waiting for compliance. This was how things worked in Dean Martin's world. You asked, people said yes. You smiled, they smiled back. You had the power, they gave you what you wanted. But what Dean Martin couldn't see was the girl who had carried resistance messages in her ballet shoes, walking past Nazi checkpoints with her heart hammering against her ribs. The teenager who had watched neighbors shot in the street for refusing to hand over hidden food. The young woman who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is know when to say no. That girl looked up at Dean Martin with eyes that had seen real power. Not Vegas showmanship, not entertainment industry leverage, but actual life and death authority. And she recognized something that made her voice go very quiet and very certain. 9 seconds. That's all it took. Audrey stood. In her heels, she was nearly eye level with Dean. When she spoke, her voice carried in the absolute silence. Every word clear and deliberate. Mr. Martin, I appreciate the invitation, but I won't sing tonight. Pause, one beat. Not because I cannot, but because I choose not to. Another beat. I came here as a guest, not as entertainment. I came to listen to your magnificent performance. I didn't come to perform myself. Final beat. And with respect, no one should be asked to perform in a room where they came simply to be. 9 seconds. 48 words delivered with perfect calm, perfect clarity, perfect grace. No anger, no drama, just truth, just dignity, just a woman standing in her power without raising her voice or making a scene. Dean Martin stood there, his hand frozen halfway through a casual gesture. His smile flickered, not quite fading, but losing its certainty. The room held its breath. 300 people suspended between what should have happened and what actually just did. The photographer from Life magazine had his finger on the shutter, but couldn't bring himself to press it. This moment felt too private, too sacred to capture. At the bar, Frank Sinatra had gone completely still, his glass halfway to his lips. Sammy Davis Jr. leaned forward in his chair, eyes wide with something that looked like amazement. The waiter stopped moving. Even the ambient sounds of the hotel beyond the Copa room seemed to fade away, as if the entire sands had paused to listen. This was impossible. This simply did not happen. In Dean Martin's world, when he smiled and asked, people said yes. When he pointed to a stage, people walked toward it. When he wanted magic, people provided it. That was how power worked in 1957 Vegas, how it had always worked. The person with the microphone made requests and everyone else complied. You didn't say no to Dean Martin, not in Vegas, not in his room, not in 1957, and certainly not with such devastating politeness, such gentle finality. But Audrey Hepburn just had. From across the room, Frank Sinatra slowly set down his drink. Sammy Davis Jr.'s eyes went wide. The photographer from Life magazine lowered his camera, realizing he had just witnessed something that couldn't be captured in a single frame. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Then something shifted in Dean's expression, like clouds moving away from the sun. The performer's mask slipped just slightly, revealing something underneath. Recognition, maybe, or respect. He looked at Audrey, really looked at her, and saw past the elegant dress and movie star beauty to something harder, something earned. The steel that survives occupation, the dignity that emerges from genuine suffering, the quiet power that comes from knowing the difference between performance and survival. In that moment, Dean Martin understood something he'd never had to understand before. He'd spent his entire career in rooms where his word was law, where his smile was currency, where his requests were granted before he finished making them. He'd forgotten, maybe never learned, that there was a difference between willing performance and coerced compliance, between art freely given and entertainment demanded. Standing there looking at this woman who had just refused him with such devastating grace, Dean felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Shame. Not the sharp sting of embarrassment, but the deeper, more complex shame of recognizing that you've revealed something ugly about yourself without meaning to. Dean took a step back. His voice, when it came, had lost its showman's projection. "You're absolutely right. Not performing now, just speaking. That was wrong of me, Miss Hepburn. You're a guest, and you should be treated as one." He extended his hand. "I apologize." Audrey took it, shook once. "Apology accepted, Mr. Martin, and thank you for an unforgettable evening." Dean nodded, turned, walked back through the crowd that parted silently before him. Behind him, Audrey sat down. Mel touched her hand under the table. "I'd like to leave now," she said quietly. They stood, walked through the Copa room, through watching eyes, through cigarette smoke, out into the Las Vegas night. Behind them, the party continued, but something had fundamentally changed. History had just been made, though most people wouldn't understand its significance for years. At the bar, Dean Martin ordered another martini and stood very still, thinking. Frank Sinatra approached, leaned against the bar beside him. "That was something, Dino." Dean nodded slowly. "She was right, Frank. Completely right." He took a sip, stared at nothing. "When did we become the kind of guys who expect women to perform on command?" Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maybe we always were. Maybe we just never met anyone with the spine to tell us." In her hotel room an hour later, Audrey sat by the window looking out at the neon-lit desert. The strip pulsed with electric color, red and blue and gold, promising dreams and delivering mostly emptiness. Mel was asleep, but she remained awake, thinking about 9 seconds that felt like the most important of her adult life. Not because of what she had said, but because of who she had remembered she was. The girl who survived the hunger winter, the teenager who carried secrets past enemy soldiers, the woman who learned that dignity is not given by others. It lives within you, and no amount of power or charm or expectation can take it away if you choose to hold it. She thought about Dean Martin's face in those final moments, how something had changed behind his eyes, how his apology had sounded genuine, surprised by its own sincerity. She hoped he would remember this feeling, this moment of seeing another person clearly, instead of seeing them as entertainment. She would never see Dean Martin again in a professional setting. But years later, when she devoted herself to humanitarian work with UNICEF, traveling to the poorest regions of the world, she would receive anonymous donations from a Vegas entertainer who signed his contributions simply, "A fan who learned respect." The amounts were always significant, enough to feed dozens of children for months, and they came like clockwork every year until his death in 1995. The story would become legend in Hollywood, told and retold in different versions. Some would exaggerate the confrontation, turning it into a screaming match it never was. Others would minimize it, reducing it to a simple misunderstanding between celebrities. But those who were there that night always remembered the same thing: how the room changed in 9 seconds, how a woman stood and said no with perfect grace, how a powerful man, after a moment of recognition, chose humility over ego, and how everyone who witnessed it left slightly different than when they arrived. The waiters spoke of it for years. The photographers developed their film but never published the pictures, sensing somehow that what they'd captured was too private for public consumption. The other celebrities carried the memory like a small weight, a reminder that even in rooms where they held all the power, dignity belonged to everyone. Dean Martin himself would think about that night for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, when asked about his greatest regrets, he would mention a night in Vegas when he learned the difference between request and demand, between charm and coercion, between being powerful and being right. "I asked a lady to sing," he would tell a reporter in 1987, "and she said no with more class than I'd shown in asking. Taught me something important about respect. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is accept someone's refusal with grace. Because that's what 9 seconds can do. Not destroy, but transform. Not humiliate, but educate. Not end, but begin something better." In the Copa room of the Sands Hotel on March 15, 1957, two people met at a crossroads, one learning that power without grace is just noise, the other remembering that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to forget who you are.